This is the Metal Gateway Podcast.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. My name is Brian Sibley, and I'm your host for the Metal Gateway Podcast. A bit of background first, before I introduce my guest for this week's show. I played bass in a death metal grindcore band, I guess, in the late 1980s. The band was called Psychotic Society. Don't bother looking us up, you won't find anything. We were a bunch of high school kids in Denver, Colorado, and we played, I think, exactly 2 gigs during the 2 years or so that we were together. We never released anything officially. Frankly, as a band, we just didn't amount to much. As far as I know, one song of ours was released some years later as part of an obscure Colorado extreme music compilation, but that song was a rehearsal recording, and frankly, it's unlistenable, so don't go looking for it, please. Anyway, the 3 other guys in the band were Carl Cumpy, who was our drummer. Carl also went to the same high school that I did. John Kennedy, he was our guitarist, and Matt Jacobson. Matt was our vocalist. The 4 of us are all about the same age, but Matt and John went to a different school than Carl and I did. If the name Matt Jacobson sounds familiar to you, it's probably because during our senior year in high school in 1990, in his mom's basement, Matt founded Relapse Records. Matt is my guest on the show this week. I don't need to recount for any of you probably the influence that Relapse has had in the intervening 30 plus years since the label was started in that basement in Aurora, Colorado. But if you're a metalhead, odds are you own something the label has released. Countless influential metal bands got their start or had significant early success on the Relapse label. Among them, Mastodon, Suffocation, Baroness, Exhumed, many, many more. And Relapse has become one of the most prominent and influential metal labels in the world. Anyway, I spent some time to sit down with my friend Matt recently, and I got to talk to him about his early days as a metalhead and the early days of Relapse. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks for listening. Matt, welcome to the show. Thanks for giving me your time today. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it. And, this is going to be a really fun one for me because you and I have so much, history and we go back so far. And I'm going to try really hard on this episode not to make this like the Brian and Matt show where we're just like telling old war stories. Because, we'll do that on maybe we'll do a special episode because we have some funny things. But some of that will come out in this episode. But I mainly just wanted to have this opportunity because you and I do have that much history, but I also don't think we've ever actually had the conversation about how did you get into metal, which is really funny because, I think we met when we were, 16 years old?
In that ballpark.
Yeah. And so I don't know how, after all these years, I don't know how I never had that conversation with you, but so there's I'm going to throw the ball into your court, man. What was your gateway into metal and how did it begin?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's to the best of my recollection, it started in the way it does for many people of our age group or era, which is with the radio. Growing up at that time in South Dakota, that's what I had access to. And I heard things like ZZ Top and some other more rock side of things that really got me excited and interested, and also things that are in the classic rock camp, such as Styx. And, I was into a variety of things that I was exposed to via FM radio. The Go-Go's was the first LP I ever got, which is a classic in my mind.
Beauty and the Beat?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That is such a great album.
So good. And, from there, after ZZ Top, and I heard Black Sabbath and some other things on the radio. Ozzy Osbourne, honestly, probably first, and then Black Sabbath. And not long after that, it started to be things like early Metallica and Iron Maiden, and then and also some different punk bands, local things. There's a band I got into from South Dakota where I was visiting my grandma, and bands like the Pixies and so on. But there's one influential moment where I found myself at what I would describe as a Colorado ranch wedding. My parents drugged me along to some wedding they were attending. And
is this before you moved to Colorado?
No, this is when I was living in Colorado.
Okay.
And, which, was starting around 7th grade, I guess. And, at that point, I had just kind of started to grow my hair long because I got a bad haircut, and I was not doing that again. And so sitting there at this ranch wedding, I call it a ranch wedding because there's people in cowboy boots and jeans and cowboy hats and leather vests and such. And I was just a teenage kid that didn't want to be there, so I had my Walkman with me and with the little yellow earbuds at the time. And,
I remember those.
Yeah. And I was sitting there listening to Iron Maiden, and I saw this, couple come in with their teenage kid who was older than I, and he walked through the entrance with ripped up jeans and long hair, and what I later discovered was a Slayer Show No Mercy t-shirt. And he saw me with my kind of long hair and yellow earbuds and approached me and asked me what I was listening to. And I said, Iron Maiden. And he's like, yeah, Iron Maiden's cool. That's cool, man. But have you ever heard Slayer or Venom or Celtic Frost?
Yeah.
And I had not. So I made sure to make a note of that and, went to my record store as soon as I had a chance and started, going down that wormhole.
So I'm trying to fix this in a particular time period. So you're talking, when was this wedding? You're probably 7th grade. So this is probably like 83, 84 maybe.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So, I mean, because obviously Show No Mercy, if that guy was wearing a Show No Mercy shirt, we're at 83 at least.
Yes. Yeah. Probably 84 is my guess. But,
yeah.
But Slayer was definitely obscure and new at that point.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. So anyway, tell me the rest of that. What did you guys have, like a conversation at that moment, or did he tip you off to some other stuff?
I mean, those are the few that I remember offhand. He might have also mentioned Bathory.
Oh, wow. So this guy, whoever he was like...
He was dialed in.
He was dialed in at that point.
Big time. And that was a big jump for me because, obviously Iron Maiden and Metallica, Ride the Lightning, I mean, those killer stuff, right? And Ride the Lightning, when I heard that, Fight Fire with Fire was the fastest thing I ever heard. And, of course, I became addicted to speed. And as soon as I was exposed to these other things that were heavier and faster, I just kept going down that path.
Yeah. And, you mentioned like some early black metal. And then of course, obviously, you mentioned, Celtic Frost, Bathory, Venom, which, we can debate whether Venom's black metal or not. But yeah. So was that kind of like, what was it about that music when you started discovering it? Like where did it take you, where did you go from there?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things about metal in general is that it was something I could do on my own. It's like, well, I certainly found other people that were into it and bonded with other people because they were into it, but it was something I could spend a lot of time just on my own. I didn't need to rely on anyone else for, and I soaked up every bit of it. And it wasn't just metal. I went in all kinds of directions. I was a sponge sucking up as much as I could. And, there's plenty of things that I was exposed to or discovered that I didn't like, and lots that I did, whether it was Fields of the Nephilim and Sisters of Mercy, or Skinny Puppy and Minor Threat, or DRI and The Accused. I mean, took me all kinds of directions, goth, industrial.
We talked about The Cure earlier today, stuff like that was all that stuff was swirling around at that time.
Yeah, and things like Pixies, I was definitely exposed to Pixies early on by this really cute girl that I met when I was visiting my grandma in South Dakota. And love that band.
Yeah. So when we met, which was probably around 1988 or so, you were already into, the stuff that was pretty, I was too, but pretty extreme stuff at that point, right? Like, you were into Carcass at that point. You were into
Cryptic Slaughter.
You were into Napalm Death, How did you get from Metallica and the Pixies and all that other stuff to like Napalm Death and Cryptic Slaughter? Like, there had to have been something going on in between there,
It happened pretty quickly, and I wish I could nail it down specifically, but there was a number of influences and factors. Maximum Rock and Roll was a publication that I discovered pretty early on and found a lot of new music in there. And also a lot of times it would be just going to either my local record store or a really kick-ass store in downtown Denver called Wax Trax that I would just flip through the bins and see a cover that looked cool and read the little description on it. And, a lot of times I would buy those things without having any idea what it really sounded like. And most instances it was really awesome. And it was something that I loved. I definitely discovered Pungent Stench that way, and Napalm Death, and a lot of bands. Cryptic Slaughter, I believe I found from just seeing it at a cassette at the mall record store at Buckingham Square Mall in Aurora, Colorado.
God, I'm trying to think who would have been distributing that at that time that got it into a mall. Like that's pretty edgy stuff to be in a mall record store in the late 80s.
It was a Metal Blade release, and Metal Blade had good distribution.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So back in the day, and I remember the day I bought Cryptic Slaughter, and opening up that cassette as soon as I got out of the store and popping in my Walkman and putting it on and being blown away by how fast they were. And also just thinking to myself that Cryptic Slaughter is the coolest band name ever.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned Maximum Rock and Roll just now. And I was wondering if you could like talk to me about what did that publication do? I mean, not just for you, but I think it's something that I don't want to sound like that old guy, but I think it's for a whole generation of us who grew up in that era, that the importance of that publication was pretty hard to overstate. And so I wanted to just hear what your thoughts on it were, because I know it was super important.
Yeah. I mean, it was important in so many ways. And I mostly think of Maximum Rock and Roll as a punk rock magazine, or what used to be hardcore, like pre-Victory Records hardcore, because the definition of that word has changed over the years and to some degree to what scene you've come from or whatnot. But the kind of hardcore crossover punk rock type stuff. But it also was a way for me to find out about things that maybe were rooted in that scene, but we're really totally different. Like that's where I first discovered Godspeed You Black Emperor was in Maximum Rock and Roll, and it was so wild when years later I see them live and they're really popular. It's like, wow, I had no idea. Anyway, the Maximum Rock and Roll was kind of the punk rock Bible in so many ways. Lots of interviews and ads and blacklist mail order. And the most important feature, not the entire time that I read it, but for a lot of it, was the top 5 list from the various contributors. And there were contributors that I would look at right away. For instance, Chris Dodge. Anything on Chris Dodge's playlist I knew that I would like because my tastes were aligned with him. And on the flip side, and I don't remember their names anymore, there was definitely contributors who anything on their top 5 I knew I wouldn't like. So I would avoid those. But yeah, it was an incredible resource to discover new music.
Yeah, and I mean, what do you think? Like, do you feel like the extreme metal scene would have flourished in the way that it did at that time without things like Maximum Rock and Roll?
I think it's interesting because the extreme music scene that I was exposed to was kind of from multiple fronts. There was the one side, which was kind of rooted in punk rock and moved into what was then described as hardcore. And that evolved into things like, brought us things like grindcore. And then there was the more traditional metal side, which came like thrash and, hair metal and all of those things. And
new wave of British heavy metal stuff.
100%. And then, if you had a Venn diagram, there's all this overlap and places where those worlds meet. And the MRR side of things, the Maximum Rock and Roll, was definitely, kind of the more punk rooted or punk evolved side of things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, they covered so much. It was really awesome. But that was, only one side of the things that I liked. And I definitely discovered lots of fanzines around that time as well, whether they were local publications like The Pit magazine from Colorado Springs, or whether it was like the Slayer mag from Scandinavia that I found through mail order, or I can't even remember the names of so many others, but definitely I was hungry for anything I could get and learn about. And, we were also lucky in Denver. And of course, I don't remember the name of the station anymore, but there was I believe it was a community television station or a college television station that had a late night video show that would play everything from Skinny Puppy to Napalm Death to whatnot. And that was pretty cool to see music videos for some of the underground stuff that I really liked. Yeah.
I don't remember. I was never a big TV watcher, so I don't remember that show actually.
It was like 1 hour a week. I can't remember, Sunday nights or something. And, MTV had its metal show later, I think. And that was fine, but this was kind of more underground stuff. So it was pretty cool.
Yeah. There was definitely, you had to be at a certain level to get on MTV, even on the Headbangers Ball, right?
Totally.
And I remember like back then too, there was Z-Rock. You remember that radio station?
Mm-hmm.
And I think at that time, Denver's Z-Rock, because Z-Rock, I think, was some sort of a franchise. Like it was
probably syndication.
Yeah, it was some sort of a syndication because they had Z-Rock stations in a bunch of markets. But in Denver, it was AM only at first. Do you remember that?
No.
It was like 1340 AM or something. I had a Z-Rock bumper sticker on my car.
Wow.
But I remember, discovering some music that way as well. But
See, it's funny thinking you're talking about radio. Radio was how I first, discovered, of course, the 80s commercial pop and the Go-Go's and Men at Work and ultimately Ozzy and those kind of things, of course, because that's how I was introduced to music, really. But not long after that, I found there was nothing I liked on radio. Like I wanted, underground metal, and there weren't outlets that I was aware of that provided that. And so for decades, I didn't even consider radio. It's not something I thought about.
Why do you think that was?
Now I can say that there were probably some college stations that I would have found some things on, but I guess I was really aware of and thinking about commercial radio, and there was just no good commercial radio, nothing that was focused in the areas I was most excited about. So I just tuned it out. Didn't rely on that as a way to discover music anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, we really had to, when I think about it back then, like we really had to discover everything on our own. I mean, I guess everybody still does that now, but it's just like, we didn't have the internet, so finding music this is why I always feel so grateful for us having Wax Trax, because Wax Trax was like huge for me.
Me too.
And I don't know what it was about the people who ran that store, but I feel like they in particular had a connection somehow to Earache. Mm-hmm. And they were getting Earache distribution before a lot of places were.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think about the fact that like the first Carcass album, I believe the initial pressing of that was 1,000 copies.
Really?
It was really a small run. And I have one of those. Mm-hmm. I got it at Wax Trax.
Yeah, me too. I got in trouble for bringing it to school with me.
I think a lot of people I hid it from my parents. I hid a lot of stuff from my parents. But yeah, I mean, so for us as those kids pre-internet to have gotten access to that music was pretty, if you think about it, 1,000 copies worldwide of that first album. I could be wrong on that number. So if somebody's listening
and there's always the first press and then subsequent pressings, right?
Sure. But I mean, the later pressings didn't come out until later. So for us to have gotten, right away, gotten Earache stuff, right out of the gate in Denver, it was entirely because of that record store.
Yeah.
And
I don't know for a fact, but I feel like Earache was perhaps distributed by Revolver or something that, brought in a lot of punk rock imports and stuff. And they, had a handful of accounts like Wax Trax. That's my guess in retrospect.
Yeah, you're probably right. But it's funny because, I guess this is part of why I also feel so lucky is, when we were in high school in Denver, the metal scene in Denver was not awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Not like it is today.
Yeah. Well, it was a much smaller population, and it was so geographically isolated. It was hard for bands to tour, to stop there, because it was just so far from everything. So economically, it just made a lot more sense to tour the East Coast or West Coast.
Right. Right. And to go through, Denver. And so our scene didn't depend, we were so grateful anytime some band did come through. Mm-hmm. But it just didn't happen as often as it does today. And the local scene wasn't as good either.
Yeah. It was just smaller.
So to have accessed this, music out of the UK and Europe, and to be getting that stuff pretty much right away after it was released I feel just so lucky, because I wouldn't have that stuff changed my life. I would not have without Wax Trax, I would not have discovered Carcass when I did. I would not have discovered Morbid Angel when I did. I would not have discovered Entombed when I did. All those early earache bands. The Grind Crusher compilation, Joe and I talked about that when I interviewed him for his episode. The influence of the Grind Crusher compilation on a particular cohort of people our age was huge.
One thing I found so interesting is that when I discovered all that, I didn't understand how new that branch of the musical tree was. I didn't know that this genre or subgenre, however you want to characterize it, was literally emerging at that time. I just thought I was discovering it and because I was discovering so many things new and dove in really deeply, really quickly. But yeah, it took a little time and space for me to be able to understand and recognize, oh, wow, this was something fresh that was really just developing. It was pretty exciting to be there and be involved.
Yeah, for sure. So let's fast forward a little bit, and I want to talk about where you went from there, because the sort of lore about your history is, you started Relapse in your mom's basement, and I've actually been in that basement, and and it's funny to think about that stuff now in hindsight. But I'd love to hear some stories, and I know a couple of them, but I'd love to hear some stories about some of the early Relapse days and things that kind of blew your mind. Mm-hmm. We were talking yesterday about how we were in my Volkswagen Bug, and we had gone to the post office, and you picked up the first demo of Suffocation, I think.
Yeah, so you were giving me a ride or picking me up from somewhere or something. And
maybe we were going to band practice or something. I don't remember.
And I was always trying to get people to bring me by the post office where my P.O. box was.
Yeah, I remember doing that a lot because we lived on the same side of town. So yeah.
And so you brought me by there, and I was always excited to see what packages or letters that I had in the P.O. box. In the early days, it was just things that I had ordered or people that I became pen pals and tape traders with. And then as time went on and John Kennedy and I did a fanzine called Horrendified. Eventually, as that started circulating a little bit, we would start to get submissions of demos from bands that were looking to, get exposure and to have their demos reviewed and get the word out there. And my recollection is the very first unsolicited demo that I received was this band from New York called Suffocation. And that day you brought me there to the post office. And of course, the first thing I always did when I got in the car is pop in whatever new tape it was.
Yeah.
I remember just being blown away by those vocals, especially, and just how heavy it was and everything at the time. It was felt like a game changer. And little did I know what it would in part lead to.
Well, yeah. And I mean, Suffocation was one of the earliest Relapse bands. Mm-hmm. And, I was last year I was at Northwest Terrorfest. I was talking to Terrence Hobbs about that period, and he said a lot of cool things, but he was just talking about how how huge Relapse was for Relapse is largely responsible for Suffocation becoming what they became, because they got so much in support and so much encouragement. And, for a truly genre defining band like they have become, that's pretty high praise for the stuff that happened. And I just think it's really neat to know that there was so much of this was like a DIY kind of thing. This was not orchestrated. This was not like a major industry thing. This was Hobbs and those guys probably back then just sending a demo off into the ether, hoping something would happen from it. And, things did happen because of that, that kind of like faith that they had in the sort of scene and the other people that were whoever's on the other end of this mail stop,
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I started asking bands like Suffocation and people that I was pen pals with if I could put out records of theirs. And, Suffocation agreed, and King Fowley and Deceased agreed, and some other folks that I had been in contact with through Horrendified or through my tape trading. And with Suffocation in particular, it was kind of funny because it was one of the first bands that agreed and that recorded material for Relapse. But they actually recorded too much material. It was too long to fit on a 7-inch EP. And so, it just seemed to make sense to try to save up enough money to ultimately press it on CD and cassette. So it actually delayed the release of that particular recording by quite a bit. But when we finally had enough money to be able to press our first CD and cassette, and it was Suffocation Human Waste, at that time we had fortunately been able to secure a distribution deal in the United States, and it literally blew my mind when I went to Sioux Falls, South Dakota to visit my grandma, and I went to the mall record store and found that Musicland store had the first Relapse CD and cassette in stock in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where my grandma lived. And I couldn't even believe this is a record that I put out and it's in a record store in South Dakota. It just blew my mind.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So what are some of the other things that, like, big milestones along the way, or like maybe like things that people haven't really talked about, or you haven't talked about much? I'm sure there's like there's way too many stories than we could ever capture.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I mean, there's a couple different journeys to talk about there. There's the personal journey. I remember there's a new kid came to our high school named Mike. He moved there from the Chicago area, and he had a mohawk, or sometimes Liberty spikes, and he brought all of these tapes of all these bands that I never heard of before. And he was a big influence in broadening my horizons. And there was a dude at my high school, an older kid. I think he flunked a grade, got held back, and named Matt Jarvis. He exposed me to a lot of early bands too. And there's definitely people all along the way that just became a great source for new bands and a big influence that way. So special when you find someone that, is like, oh, you like that band? Well, you got to check out this band too. You're like, you're going to love this. And then when you do, it's like a total buzz. And I had the reverse of that too, where I would, send off a demo tape or a copy of this album to my pen pal in New York or wherever. And, some of these pen pals became kind of phone buddies because, music brings you together. And pre-internet, it's not like I had a lot of people that I knew and that lived in my neighborhood that were into, this kind of music. And so, you develop these relationships from afar. And I would call up a friend of mine or get a call from him after he got the latest package that I sent him and hear his excitement for whatever band that I sent that I was so excited about. He was getting a buzz off of it, and I got a buzz off of him getting a buzz. And that was just something that I got such a good feeling from, is exposing people to things that they loved as much as I did. And, ultimately Relapse became me just doing that on a larger scale than tape trading one-on-one.
Yeah. Yeah. When did it become clear to you that, like, doing Relapse, doing a label was going to be your path?
It wasn't,
because it could have gone in a lot of different ways, right? Like, we were in this weird bad death metal band in the late 80s. Like, maybe you were going to go down that road. Like, when did you decide to go down the road you went down?
Yeah. There was a point where I thought being in a band was going to be my career. It's why I skipped my one and only real family vacation that my family took to Disneyland to stay back so our band could play one of the 2 shows we ever played.
Yeah.
I was so committed to the band and really thought that, either that band or a subsequent band was going to be my career or future for that moment in time, is what it felt like. And, with Relapse, I'd like to say that I had a plan, or I saw what it was going to be, or understood what it could be, but I didn't really, just kind of one thing at a time. And then you just get busy, and you're just, doing it every day. And then you rarely stop to reflect. And I remember there was a day in the early years when I was in my Bill Yurkevich basement. He became my business partner, 6 months or a year after I started Relapse. He joined the company and ended up ultimately, after my parents' basement, in his parents' basement. And I remember working late one night and somehow, in the basement by myself, just, I don't know, somehow I took a moment to reflect, and things were it was very early on, and we hadn't accomplished much at that point, but I was in that moment of reflecting, blown away by how much we had accomplished. Like, wow, we've put out like one CD and one cassette and a few 7-inches, and we have distribution now. And I was like, wow, that's so much more than I thought we could ever do. And then I remember thinking, well, why did I think that we couldn't do that much? And then I decided I was going to flip it, and I'm just going to assume that we can do anything versus assume that we can't. And that attitude has generally served me pretty well since then.
Yeah, and I think, that's, when I think back to the genesis of how, how you and I met, it was just kind of by chance. Like, you and John had put up a flyer. You were looking for a bassist and a drummer. My friend Carl and I went to a different high school. Carl was a drummer. I was a bassist. And Carl found this flyer. And he brought it to school the next day. And it was like, okay, here's these two guys, a vocalist and a guitarist, looking for a bassist and a drummer. So that right there, we're like, holy crap. Because Carl and I had been talking about like, hey, we should start a band. But we didn't know who else was going to be in the band because we were the only two metalheads at school. Because we went to this tiny little high school, right? And so you guys had put on that flyer that your influences were like Carcass and Napalm Death and all the bands that Carl and I loved. And we were like, this is like too good to be true, But it was like, to what you just said earlier, you and John just like sort of put that thing out there and we happened to find it. But it was almost like what you just said. Why couldn't we just at least give it a try?
Yeah.
Like, who knows? And then when we finally called you guys, and, I think John thought we were doing a prank call at first when we called him. He was like, you guys can't be possibly serious. You guys can't possibly be a drummer and a bassist that listens to the same music we listen to. That's impossible. And it was like, no, it wasn't impossible. And so that's just funny because we took that and, basically made it real because you guys just threw this flyer up in the guitar store one day.
It all lined up.
Yeah. It's really funny. And I just think about like what a journey it's all been for all of us. We've all gone our separate ways. And I think, we've all done various things in metal to various degrees over the years, but it's just been really neat to sort of, first of all, to stay in touch with all you guys over these years. And then just to also just sort of see what everybody's done. It's been really fun. I guess what I'm really curious about with Relapse was a couple things that you've said to me over the years. One of the things was like the reason you named Relapse was because you didn't want it to be sort of limiting. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah. But I'm happy to tell the story. I think when I was trying to think of names, so actually, I barely graduated high school. As part of barely graduating, I ended up in the alternative high school, which was in a separate building with basically dropout risk kids. And one thing was cool about it is that, it wasn't regular curriculum. It was made to make it easier for kids to graduate and also for people to kind of work with a smaller group. You called teachers by their first name. There were 7 or 10 kids in class and you worked at your own pace. And, one of my English credits was Stephen King literature, which was something more palatable for me at that time than the mainstream high school curriculum. And one of my English credits was poetry. And in the poetry class, I basically wrote thrash metal lyrics and got credit for it. And out of those thrash metal lyrics came made up bands, and made up bands led to made up record labels. And so I created a logo and everything for Bloody Corpse Records. And, that was just fun. It was make believe. And when I later started to think about doing a label, that was my first thought, was to go with Bloody Corpse Records. And, then John Kennedy and I, we did a fanzine, as I mentioned, called Horrendified, and we were going to do a cassette comp label. And so we both came up with a list of names that we were interested in and compared notes. And ultimately we agreed on Lethal Records as the one that we both liked from our lists. I think my list probably had Bloody Corpse and Relapse on it, but anyway, when later down the line, I got serious about doing a label, I was thinking about names, and I wanted something that wasn't going to pigeonhole what we did completely. I wanted something that was, not Kill Your Mom Records, because I had a pretty broad interest in music, mostly underground, but from all kind of different genres. And while metal was at the top of the list, probably, it was, lots of punk and hardcore and experimental and industrial and whatnot, goth. And yeah, I just, I liked Relapse Records because of the alliteration and because Relapse was, easy to say, easy to pronounce, and it had a certain ring to it, and it had maybe an implied negative connotation, which felt kind of dark and metal like, but it wasn't just metal. And yeah, just seemed to be the right fit.
I think what's really cool in the spirit of all that is to think about, the breadth of releases that, because there's been stuff that's come out on Relapse that is not metal at all, but it's really primarily known as, of course, as a metal label. For sure. So, there was like some ambient stuff that you guys put out, and I think it's just neat to see that was, the promise of what you were trying to do actually came true.
Yeah, it is kind of neat. We definitely did some things that maybe some of the other labels that were kind of more in that thrash and death metal, grindcore, extreme metal world maybe wouldn't have done or didn't do, whether it was something like Dead World in the early days,
right?
Kind of more on the industrial metal
noise,
kind of
noise
crossover,
even.
Yeah. Or later putting out straight up harsh noise, or man, now I'm drawing a blank. We did a lot of things outside the realm of just straight metal, that's for sure.
Yeah. One of the other things I wanted to ask you is about I wanted to ask about the role of like compilations too in that, because I feel like, Relapse has always done compilations. I think back to like Corporate Death. You guys did that, which was so awesome. And, I think Relapse still does like a streaming compilation on the regular basis. But I'm interested in like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I feel like the compilation was really, really important before the internet. And I'm just sort of interested in how has that evolved?
I agree with that completely. And I think that compilation was an important way for, people to discover new music. And also it kind of represented a time and place, right? Like, you mentioned the Grind Crusher compilation that Earache put out, which was game changing and world changing for people like you and I, but, represented a place and time. And lots of other compilations, I think, kind of did the same thing in its own way. Some of my favorite compilations, of many of which are pretty obscure and maybe very hard to find, but the Pussmort compilation, that
the
label Pusshead.
That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. The Pussmort compilation. Yep. Wow.
Pussmort Records was put out by a cat named Pusshead, who was I think he was a skater, and he wrote for Thrasher magazine, and he later became famous for doing Metallica t-shirt artwork. But he had his own label that put out some killer shit, and he was in an amazing band called Septic Death.
Yep.
But a couple of his compilations, like Cleanse the Bacteria, and one I think just called Pussmort, were fucking incredible. Also, an obscure compilation that I think is really amazing is called The Pathological Comp. It was the first release on Pathological Records, which I think was short-lived, but, had some really great and weird bands and some exclusive tracks from some, bands that were big in my world at that time, like Godflesh and Napalm Death and Carcass. But yeah, the compilation, it's something that's not easy to do right. And, it's rare that you would like all tracks from all the bands on any given compilation, but that's okay to have, just some of it be what resonates. And yeah, compilations are fun.
Yeah, I mean, the Grind Crusher for sure. There was, 3 or 4 tracks on there that I still listen to that compilation because it's partly for nostalgic value, but also just because it's just awesome. But there's a handful of tracks on there that I'm just like, I just still don't understand. 30 some odd years later, I don't get why they put that on here. It doesn't make any sense to me. But that's okay because like you said, it doesn't have to be all things to all people. And I think if I think about the Relapse compilations, the what'd you call it, Contaminated, I think was
that was a series.
That was a series of I think about those, and it was just like it's a sampling of what's happening right now, and it's a good snapshot in time. And yeah, I'd be surprised if anybody likes everything on that compilation. That's not the point.
Yep.
But yeah, I've certainly discovered plenty of awesome music over the years from compilations and stuff that I might not have encountered otherwise, because you start digging around in a label's catalog and, it's impossible, especially now. I mean, metal is like, it's an embarrassment of riches right now. There's just so much stuff and nobody can possibly know it all anymore.
Yeah, the world has changed. The internet has changed a lot of things obviously.
There's an understatement. So yeah, I mean, I guess, that's sort of, those are the majority of things I really wanted to discuss. And I is there anything else that you feel like in the context of this conversation that you feel like we ought to, talk about or?
I mean, one thing I'll say kind of along the tip of some of the stuff we touched on is just, I think the importance of those people that we've all had in our lives that will be a source of new music for a long time. Whether at one point it was an outlet like a record store or a mail order. I remember circling bands and albums in the Blacklist catalog that was included in Maximum Rock and Roll, or the Mosh Pit catalog that was associated with Pit Magazine, or a number of other ones that I probably don't remember the names of anymore from back in the day, or those people and friends and band members and so on that you just learned their tastes or learned to trust their judgment. And honorable mention to Dave Whitty. Dave Whitty is one of the best dudes of all time. He's also an incredible drummer that plays in Municipal Waste and previously Burnt by the Sun and East West Blast Test and a number of other awesome bands. And he's just one of those guys that has great taste and a lot of enthusiasm and happens to be traveling the world because he's in touring bands. And I always knew, like, anytime Dave Whitty told me about whether it was a band or a brewery or a restaurant, he knows what's up and pay attention. And people like him and Sean Pelletier and Tom Haley and a lot of other people in my life that have just exposed me to so much great music. It's something I treasure.
What do you think you would say is the thing, about your life in metal that you're most proud of doing?
With Relapse, one of the things I'm most proud of is that we did put out a pretty broad array of music and a lot of things that were outside of a particular genre or focus. And I always wanted to kind of push that I don't know, open-mindedness maybe, in our mail order catalog that we did, we would carry lots of things like Coil and, a lot of industrial and just underground stuff from various genres and really try to promote that. And I think we turned a lot of people on to things that they maybe wouldn't have discovered otherwise. And I'm really proud of that. And I also remember thinking it's very funny, like back to our very first catalog, we had our playlists in there, the list of the records that we really loved. And at that given time, and that very first catalog, I know that on my playlist, it included some of my favorite albums, which were still the Go-Go's and Depeche Mode and The Cure and alongside Incantation and Mortician and lots of super heavy death and grind bands. And there were some people in the scene, especially at that time, that thought you were a poser if you didn't only like brutal death metal.
Right.
And I just thought that was so stupid. Like, to each his own, man, but like, I don't know. It just seems so silly to limit yourself to this narrow little range of music when there, in my opinion, was just so many more awesome things in addition to that out there that, you might as well be open to and enjoy some of. So, some people would try to give me shit for it or make fun of me, and I would just scoff and walk away like, whatever, man.
Yeah. No, that's true. I've had a lot of those interactions over the years with somebody who just thinks they're too cool for anything that's not, whatever, right?
Yep.
Whether they're a black metal elitist or a death metal elitist, it's like, it's the same flavor. And that happens. I think that probably happens in every genre.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Sure. I mean, it's not something that's unique to metal. There are people in, whatever. So yeah, that's cool. That's cool. I think that's definitely something that's worth, being proud of, like, because yeah, I mean, that's what, it's what it's all about, I think, is, expanding our mind and expanding our, understanding of the world and the various things that are out there for us to, enjoy. And there's so many different ways to, like, have a cool experience with music.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so great. I do have one final question that I ask everybody on this podcast before I end the episode. And that question is this: if you could have dinner with any metal musician, living or dead, who would it be?
Wow.
And take your time.
Yeah, that's a good one. A tough one. I don't know. I guess in part because he's gone and Relapse reissued the entire Death catalog. Chuck from Death is on my list, but he has a reputation for being a jerk, so that makes me question it. But that's one that comes to mind because I mean, one of the amazing things about what Chuck did with Death is and rare things is he innovated multiple subgenres. For someone that has recorded and released arguably one of the first death metal albums, and then to be one of the front runners and putting out the super technical death metal. And I mean, he is pretty incredible, pretty influential. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, that would certainly be an interesting conversation, I'm sure. Well, Matt, I'm sure we could continue talking for another 3 hours, but I do not want to bore my audience here. So thank you so much for doing this. I feel like it's kind of overdue. Like we should have probably had this discussion multiple times over the years, but it's just, it's always great when I get to spend time with you and I've really enjoyed this conversation and I, hope we can do this again at some point. And, there's lots of great stories to tell and it's just fun. So, so thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you including me and I had a lot of fun, chatting as well. And I look forward to another time in the future.
And that's our show for today. Earlier in this episode, Matt and I talked about that first Carcass album, Reek of Putrefaction, and I made a mistake in the interview. The first pressing of that album came out in 1988 on Earache Records, and in the episode I had incorrectly remembered that was limited to 1,000 copies worldwide. It was actually 3,000 copies worldwide. So, yeah. Sorry about that. My mistake. But still, 3,000 copies. Not very many copies of that album. And I feel really lucky that I still have one of those 3,000. Yeah, so I stand corrected. Thank you very much. Anyway, as a side note, I just wanted to say that when I started this project, I wasn't really sure how people were going to respond to being asked to sit down with me for like an hour and talk about their personal journey with metal music. So I decided that I was just going to take a leap of faith and start out by talking to people that I knew. I was just going to start there. And that's why these first few episodes are interviews with people who are just old friends of mine. Joe Gersh, who was on episode 1. Today's episode with Matt Jacobson. I've known both of those guys since the 1980s. And then my interview next week, which you're going to have to wait to see who that one is with, that's with another person that I've known for years and years and years. And these are just old friends of mine. And so those are some of the first interviews that I did. As I've gotten deeper into the project and started asking people that I haven't known for years and years, I started talking to people I'd only known for a short time or people that I had just met. And I've just been so delighted and humbled because nearly every single person I've approached has said yes to this project. So that just feels really good. And it makes me so excited to share this project with all of you. So I'm looking forward to the rest of this season. Thank you for sticking with me this far. I think you're really going to be excited about some of the episodes that I have coming up, and I'm really excited about them myself. So thanks. This podcast is a production of Studio Portcullis. Our theme music is by Tauntaun. If you have comments, questions, suggestions for guests you'd like to see on the show, please email them to me at metalgatewaypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at metalgateway. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.